We call them the Dark Ages, a label stamped by Renaissance scholars dismissing a millennium as stagnant and grim. But through Rudolf Steiner's eyes, this era blazes with life, a battleground of ideas where Celtic bards, Germanic wanderers, and Slavic mystics forged the modern world. Steiner's 1904 lectures, delivered over 8 pivotal weeks, reveal a hidden narrative, not of kings and conquests, but of invisible forces, what he termed folk souls, clashing and merging to birth our concepts of freedom, law, and self. This is history as you've never seen it, a story where the past isn't dead, but alive in every debate about power, identity, and progress. To understand Steiner's Middle Ages, we must abandon familiar tropes. No knights in shining armor, no damsels in distress. Instead, 3 threads guide us. 1, the folk souls, Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic, that shaped Europe's spiritual DNA. 2, the 11th century urban revolutions where freedom first took root. 3, the rebels who lit the fuse for the Reformation and beyond. Let's begin where Steiner does, not with empires, but with cultures. Picture this. While Rome was collapsing under the weight of its own conquest-obsessed culture, something extraordinary was happening in the forests and villages of Central Europe. Barbaric peoples who couldn't read or write were developing inner qualities that would eventually give birth to universities, cities, and the modern concept of individual freedom. These weren't just migrations across continents, they were fundamental rewrites of what it means to be human. Steiner identified 3 Central European peoples whose mingling and conflicts shaped the soul of medieval civilization: the Celts, the Germanic tribes, and the Slavs. Each brought unique spiritual qualities that would echo through the next 1,000 years. The Celts, in Steiner's words, possessed active, energetic, mentally alert blood, naturally inclined toward revolutionary impulses. They were not merely warriors, they were the creative force behind the great medieval legends. The tales of Roland, Tristan, and Parsifal, all the stories that captured the medieval imagination, sprang from Celtic genius. Even in the realm of science, Celtic thought left its mark, though much of their culture faded as they were gradually pushed westward by advancing Germanic tribes. Yet Celtic blood carried something special, a fiery creativity that later sparked spiritual movements flowing from Ireland and Scotland. When Celtic monks journeyed to spread Christianity among the Franks, they brought with them a profound learning and mystical insight that the more practically minded Germanic peoples had not yet developed. The Germanic tribes, meanwhile, represented a very different spirit. Steiner emphasized their courage, their restless roaming, and their deep affinity with nature, while the Greeks produced sublime art and the Romans constructed intricate legal systems. The Germanic peoples cultivated what Steiner called domestic and martial virtues, a practical efficiency always directed toward useful ends. What truly set them apart, however, was their vision of heroism. Unlike the Greeks and Romans, who celebrated external victory, the Germanic peoples honored heroes who maintained their soul's integrity even in the face of outward defeat. Figures like Siegfried and Roland embodied this unbowed spirit, heroes who stood firm through suffering and loss, demonstrating a triumph of the soul rather than the world. For the Germanic peoples, the divine was not found in external images or grand temples, but was worked out inwardly, deep within the heart. From the east, the Slavs pressed forward, shaping the landscape of Europe and contributing their own cultural elements. Their arrival forced the Germanic tribes to move and adapt, adding new layers to the evolving tapestry of medieval society. This continual movement and intermingling created the dynamic tensions that would drive the development of the Middle Ages. Steiner saw this process of blending as absolutely essential. The Celtic revolutionary spark, the Germanic depth of soul, and the Slavic influences combined to create something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that for the first time began to prioritize inner spiritual development over mere external conquest. To understand why this transformation is so significant, it is necessary to recognize just how radically medieval values diverged from those of the ancient world. In Greek culture, for all its artistic brilliance, achievement was reserved for a narrow elite. The highest accomplishments in philosophy, art, and public life were possible only for those who stood atop a society built on conquest. For the free Greek citizen, labor, even artistic or intellectual work, was considered beneath their dignity. This deep-seated disdain for labor would, in the end, contribute to the unraveling of Greek civilization. Roman history, too, was defined by an unbroken chain of conquest. The Roman Empire expanded relentlessly, but once it reached the limits of its power and could conquer no more, its inner vitality faded and the empire collapsed under its own weight. In stark contrast, the development of the Germanic peoples followed a wholly different path. Their evolution took place largely before the great historical struggles that marked the ancient world, allowing their essential character to remain untainted by the influence of conquered populations. Where the Greeks prized racial distinction and the Romans valued status based on citizenship and property, the Germanic tribes were quietly nurturing a revolutionary ideal, the notion of a free personality, shaped not by birth or inheritance, but by individual merit and self-acquired skill. This groundbreaking concept came into sharpest focus with the rise of medieval cities in the 11th century. Steiner points to this era as a turning point. People flocked to these new urban centers in search of freedom. Freedom from oppression and the opportunity to shape their lives through useful work and personal achievement rather than inherited status or noble title. In these medieval cities, status was not determined by ancient lineage or imperial decree. Instead, only what a person gained through their own effort and activity truly mattered. The fierce struggles for independence waged by princes and knights were outward expressions of a much deeper transformation, the emergence of the free personality as the foundation of society. Steiner described this moment as a significant transition stage, noting it was not like this either in ancient Greece or in ancient Rome. In the medieval city, for the first time, the individual's worth was measured by personal accomplishment and self-mastery, a legacy that continues to shape the modern world. Yet Steiner's analysis reaches far beyond the surface of social structures and political change. He understood these historical shifts as outward expressions of a much deeper transformation, the evolution of human consciousness itself, shaped by what he called the development of different folk souls. Both the Germanic and Slavic peoples, Steiner observed, shared an extraordinary depth in their cultural imagination. Their sagas and songs did not simply recount heroic deeds. Instead, they explored the full range of what the human heart could endure and what might ultimately redeem it. This was a new sense of tragedy, one that differed profoundly from the ancient world. In Greek and Roman traditions, heroes were celebrated for their outward success and the favor of fortune. By contrast, among the Germanic peoples, admiration was reserved for those who, even in the face of external failure, preserved the integrity of their soul. The true hero was not the one who triumphed in battle, but the one who remained steadfast in spirit and rectitude, regardless of the outcome. This shift in the conception of heroism had far-reaching consequences. Out of this new inner orientation grew the seeds of religious reform centuries before Luther. The Germanic peoples, Steiner explained, increasingly sought to become active participants in shaping their own faith. Well before the Reformation, figures like John Wycliffe in England championed the idea that individuals should read and interpret the Bible for themselves, a movement that arose from the folk spirit's demand for personal spiritual responsibility. Even in the early Middle Ages, there were signs of this yearning for religious independence. Emperor Henry II, for example, called for an ecclesia non romana, a church free from Roman control. This was not a rejection of spirituality, but rather an assertion of the right to inner spiritual autonomy. Steiner saw in these developments the gradual emergence of a new ideal, the unrestrained organization of society grounded in the Germanic impulse toward freedom. Despite all the forces that have led to the Middle Ages being remembered as dark, it was during this time that the thought of freedom was quietly but powerfully taking shape. Now the narrative arrives at the heart of Steiner's insight into medieval history. While traditional accounts linger on battles, dynasties, and shifting borders, Steiner directs attention to a subtler drama unfolding within human consciousness itself. The Germanic character, shaped in the crucible of pre-conquest life, preserved its essential qualities throughout the medieval centuries. Rather than being molded by the act of conquering others, these peoples developed their identity beforehand, allowing them to carry forward a spirit that would gradually evolve into revolutionary ideals. According to Steiner, the consciousness of freedom that later inspired Enlightenment philosophers and continues to animate modern social movements was, in fact, born in those centuries so often dismissed as dark. Medieval society, in Steiner's view, was marked by a continual struggle against various forms of unfreedom. In ancient Greece, the boundaries of oppression were drawn between citizens and slaves, the free and the conquered. In Rome, it was the distinction between those with citizenship and those excluded from the rights of the state. The Middle Ages introduced new barriers. Here, unfreedom was enforced through sheer physical power and social hierarchy. Yet, as Steiner traced the arc of history, he saw each of these barriers gradually giving way. The chains of slavery and exclusion fell, one after another. Only economic unfreedom remained as a persistent obstacle into modern times, and even that was being challenged as the ideal of the free personality gained strength. Steiner summarized this evolution with characteristic clarity. More and more clearly has the striving for complete freedom of personality shown itself. The ancient Greek valued distinction of race, the Roman distinction of person. Modern man attaches value to capitalism, to a show of wealth. The direction of human evolution, he argued, pointed steadily toward the dismantling of every barrier that prevented the full development of the individual. Ultimately, Steiner envisioned a future in which these obstacles would be swept away, clearing the ground for a new ideal, the human being liberated from all forms of oppression, no longer bound by the gravity of earthly limitations, and able to lift their gaze freely toward higher possibilities. The practical results of this profound shift in consciousness became visible in two revolutionary developments: the founding of free cities and the wave of inventions and discoveries that marked the close of the Middle Ages. Both of these, Steiner explained, were not the result of slow incremental change, but rather what he called leaps in historical development. Just as in nature, where transformation often comes suddenly after long preparation, so too in history do underlying processes reach a critical point and give rise to entirely new forms. The emergence of medieval cities was one such leap. Despite the remarkable efficiency, intellect, and depth of Frankish Christian culture, something essential was missing: the spirit of science. While the culture of the Franks excelled in moral influence and religious devotion, it had not yet developed the kind of external, practical science needed to improve agriculture, advance economic systems, and create new technologies. This missing element arrived from an unexpected source: the Arabs. While much of European Christianity remained preoccupied with questions of morality and dogma, Arab civilization had cultivated medicine, chemistry, mathematics, and the practical sciences to a high degree. In the Moorish cities of Spain and North Africa, centers of learning flourished, producing a depth and seriousness of scientific work that the great scholar Alexander von Humboldt would later describe as unparalleled in the history of culture. When this Arab scientific influence encountered the disciplined intellectual training of European monasteries, where scholasticism had honed the powers of logic and rigorous thought, a new synthesis emerged. The Arabs provided the foundations of objective science, while the monastic tradition contributed a disciplined and methodical approach to reasoning. From this meeting of cultures sprang the great inventions of the medieval world: the compass, gunpowder, and printing. These breakthroughs were not the products of idle speculation, but of practical minds trained in rigorous thought and now liberated to apply their skills to the material challenges of their age. Each invention marked a decisive step in the unfolding of a new, freer human spirit. Modern observers often misunderstand medieval scholasticism, dismissing it as little more than dry academic hair-splitting. Yet Steiner recognized in scholastic education a unique and rigorous training in logical thinking, unmatched in any other period of world history. The scholastic curriculum was structured around the study of 7 sciences, the 3 foundational disciplines. Grammar, logic, and dialectics formed the basis of intellectual development. Grammar was the science of speech, logic the science of thinking, and dialectics the art of defending truth according to precise rules. Building upon these were the 4 higher sciences: geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. The latter understood not simply as an art, but as the science of cosmic harmony and order. Among these, dialectics held a place of particular importance. It was not merely a method of argument, but the disciplined practice of defending a truth against all challenges using the proper rules of reasoning. Mastery of dialectics required a deep understanding of the laws of logic and the ability to avoid the pitfalls of sophistry. Through this demanding training, scholasticism cultivated what Steiner described as a scientific and scholarly conscience, the capacity to make careful, conscientious distinctions about what could and could not be rationally justified. This intellectual discipline produced the clear and incisive thinking that would become the bedrock of modern science. Many of the conceptual frameworks that contemporary science relies upon, such as the distinction between subject and object, were first articulated and refined during the scholastic period. The great scientists of the late Middle Ages and early modern era, including figures like Copernicus and Giordano Bruno, were themselves products of this educational tradition. Far from being powerful political leaders, they were often humble monks whose formal training was deeply rooted in the methods and spirit of church scholasticism. Their achievements stand as enduring testimony to the intellectual legacy of the medieval world. Steiner's analysis reveals that the Middle Ages were, in truth, a period of profound revolution rather than mere reaction. Far from being passive recipients of tradition, medieval people were actively engaged in the creation of new forms of human organization, forms grounded in inner spiritual development rather than external coercion. The founding of cities stands as a testament to this spirit. People gathered in urban centers, not simply for economic opportunity, but to escape oppression and direct their lives toward meaningful, useful activity achieved through personal effort. Within these cities, guilds emerged to protect the freedom of artisans and craftsmen. These organizations not only safeguarded individual rights, but also fostered a sense of cooperation and mutual responsibility among citizens. As the breath of freedom began to stir within the cities, a new kind of intellectual life took root. Previously, those seeking higher learning had to travel to established centers in Italy or France. But soon, German universities began to appear. Prague in 1348, Vienna in 1365, Heidelberg in 1386. These institutions became beacons of knowledge and independence, reflecting the growing desire for intellectual and spiritual autonomy. Along the Rhine, a distinctive current of German mysticism began to flow, embodied by figures such as Meister Eckhart, Johannes Tauler, and Henry Suso. These independent monks spoke directly to the hearts of the people, offering teachings that were both deeply edifying and spiritually profound. Through their writings and sermons, the German language itself was elevated to new heights of beauty and expressive power, levels that would not be matched again for centuries. All of this unfolded in contrast to the secularized clergy, who had become increasingly entangled in political conflicts and wars of self-interest. The true spiritual movement of the age was often found outside the official institutions, developing independently and at times being condemned as heretical by the very authorities who claimed to represent the faith. Steiner viewed the remarkable developments of the Middle Ages as part of a much larger pattern in human evolution. For him, history was never a random sequence of events, but the unfolding of deeper spiritual laws working through human society. The great folk migrations, which so often appear in textbooks as mere movements of population, were in Steiner's eyes profound spiritual transformation. Each people brought with them distinct qualities of consciousness that needed to interact, mix, and develop in particular ways. The Celts contributed a creative, revolutionary impulse. The Germanic tribes brought depth of soul and a practical sense for organization and efficiency. The Slavs added their own essential spiritual elements. When these streams converged under the unique conditions of the medieval world, they laid the groundwork for the consciousness that would define modernity. The struggle for the free personality, which first took visible form in the self-governing cities of the Middle Ages, would eventually blossom into the individualism of the Renaissance, the quest for religious freedom during the Reformation, and the democratic ideals of the modern era. Yet Steiner recognized that this evolutionary process was still incomplete. While the Middle Ages witnessed the gradual dismantling of many forms of slavery, restrictions on citizenship, and the dominance of physical force, one significant barrier remained: economic unfreedom. Medieval city culture had begun to address this challenge through the establishment of guilds and the protection of artisan independence. But the realization of true economic freedom was, in Steiner's view, a task that continued to evolve beyond the medieval period. Medieval civilization, in Steiner's view, served as a vital bridge between the coercion-based societies of antiquity and the freedom-oriented cultures of the modern world. While the Greeks and Romans reached extraordinary cultural heights, their achievements rested on the subjugation and labor of enslaved majorities. By contrast, medieval society, despite its outward roughness and complexity, was steadily working toward ideals that could ultimately embrace all people. At the heart of this transformation was the Germanic recognition that every individual possesses an inherent spiritual dignity, independent of external status or birth. This revolutionary insight, first nurtured in the forests of Europe and later developed in the vibrant life of medieval cities, became a force that would eventually challenge every form of human oppression. The people of the Middle Ages were not seeking to preserve the rigid hierarchies of the ancient world. Rather, they were engaged in the creation of new forms of human relationship, the rise of city culture, the founding of universities, the flourishing of mystical movements, and the early stirrings of religious reform all pointed in the same direction, toward increasing individual freedom within cooperative and supportive social structures. Steiner saw these medieval achievements as essential groundwork for what was to come. The consciousness of freedom that took root during this era would in time need to expand beyond social and political life, reaching into economic relationships, international affairs, and the very core of spiritual existence. What makes Steiner's interpretation so compelling is the way it reframes our entire understanding of historical progress. The Middle Ages, rather than marking a decline from classical greatness, appear as a necessary stage in the unfolding of human consciousness. Each era has faced the fundamental challenge of balancing individual freedom with social cooperation. In the ancient world, this balance was achieved through systems of coercion, slavery, conquest, and rigid hierarchies. By contrast, the people of the Middle Ages began to experiment with new forms of voluntary association, the rise of cities, the organization of guilds, the founding of universities, and the creation of mystical communities all reflected a shift toward cooperation rooted in freedom rather than force. Modern societies have inherited both the medieval aspiration for the free personality and the ongoing challenge of organizing complex communities without resorting to coercion. The work of achieving true economic, political, and spiritual freedom remains unfinished, demanding conscious effort from each generation. In concluding his exploration of the Middle Ages, Steiner echoed Hegel's insight that history is the progress of humanity to consciousness of freedom. Yet Steiner emphasized that this progress does not unfold automatically. It requires a living understanding of and engagement with the achievements of those who came before. The medieval men and women who gathered in cities, established universities, developed rigorous habits of thought, and asserted their spiritual independence were not primitive ancestors to be looked down upon. They were pioneers, striving toward the same ideals that continue to inspire those who value freedom today. Their insights and achievements remain profoundly relevant. The story of the Middle Ages reveals that human progress is never guaranteed. It is always the result of conscious striving by individuals willing to challenge the limitations of their time. The creative spark of the Celts, the soul depth of the Germanic peoples, and the unique contributions of the Slavs combined to open up new possibilities that humanity is still working to fully realize. Their legacy is a reminder that every generation must take up the task of expanding human freedom. Medieval people broke through the barriers of their own era. The question remains, what barriers are we called to overcome in ours? This is why Steiner found medieval history so deeply inspiring. Far from being an age of darkness, those centuries were illuminated by the light of human beings, discovering their capacity for inner freedom and outward cooperation. Their achievements continue to guide the ongoing evolution toward greater consciousness and authentic liberty. The next time the Middle Ages are dismissed as backward or ignorant, it is worth remembering that those centuries gave rise to universities, cities, scientific inquiry, individual spiritual freedom, and the very ideal of the free personality that modern civilization holds dear. Perhaps the true legacy of the Middle Ages is not a longing for lost hierarchies, but a renewed appreciation for the revolutionary discovery that every human soul possesses infinite worth and creative potential. That insight, born in the so-called darkness of the medieval world, remains humanity's brightest hope for the future. Every idea and insight you've heard in this video comes straight from Rudolf Steiner's collected works 51, History of the Middle Ages. Steiner's vision invites us to look beyond the surface of history, to see the Middle Ages not as a time of darkness, but as a crucible where the ideals of freedom, individuality, and spiritual growth were forged. If you found this journey eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Your support helps us bring more hidden histories and transformative ideas to light. What do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of the Middle Ages? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective and keep the conversation going. Thanks for watching, and remember, the past is never just behind us. It's the foundation we build our future on. See you in the next video.